Let's talk about the first, and arguably the most seductive way a narcissist gets you to do what they want: charm and love bombing. This is where it all begins. Before the manipulation, before the gaslighting, before the guilt. There's the sparkle, the intense eye contact, the compliments that feel a little too good, the uncanny sense that this person gets you in a way nobody else ever has. That's not an accident. It's a calculated strategy. When a narcissist wants to pull you in, do that. They don't start with control. They start with a genuine kind, but not. It's more like performance art designed to disarm you. They'll mirror your interests, echo your values, laugh at your jokes a little too hard. It feels organic, like chemistry, but it's actually mimicry. Psychologically, it's called mirroring, and it's incredibly effective at creating a sense of intimacy. Your brain processes that mirroring as similarity, and similarity breeds trust. What happens next is what's known as love bombing. That term might sound sweet, like flowers and chocolate, but in this context, it's a psychological blitz. They overwhelm you with penchant gifts, constant messages, maybe even declarations of destiny. You've never felt this way about anyone. You're the only one who really understands me. They push intimacy fast, not to build a bond, but to bypass your defenses, to shortcut your critical thinking. Why does this work so well? It taps into two core human needs: the need to be seen and the need to feel significant. We all crave affirmation. Narcissists weaponize that craving. They study what makes you feel good about yourself and then feed it back to you in concentrated doses. For a while, you feel elevated, special, chosen. It's a dopamine rush, addictive. Now here's the deeper layer, the philosophical one. When we experience that kind of intense positive attention, we often assume it reflects something real. We believe, if someone sees me as extraordinary, maybe I'm extraordinary. We outsource our self-worth to their perception of us. But with a narcissist, that perception isn't rooted in who you are. It's about what they want. Their admiration isn't a mirror. It's temper mirror. It's a projection area. And because once the hook is set, once you're emotionally invested, the dynamic shifts to that. The very things they praise you for might be things they criticize. The person who once couldn't stop texting you now becomes distant, distracted, cold. You're left confused, trying to figure out what changed, and more importantly, how to get that original connection back. And that's a trap. You begin to chase the version of them that never existed, the charming, idealizing version. And in doing so, you become easier to manipulate. Every time they withhold affection or validation, it hurts. And every time they give it in, even in small doses, it feels like a reward. This is intermittent reinforcement, the same principle that keeps people hooked on slot machines. It's not the consistency that keeps us addicted. It's the unpredictability. To think about that, the very charm that drew you in becomes the leash that holds you, because you're not just trying to please them. You're trying to recover that moment when you felt adored, seen, safe. But with a narcissist, that moment was never about you. It was bait. And this is why awareness is so crucial. When you can recognize charm as a tool, not a truth, you stop seeing it as a sign of connection and start seeing it for what it is: a tactic. Charm in itself isn't bad, but when it's used to override boundaries or accelerate closeness without substance, it's not romance. It's manipulation. So the next time someone showers you with praise or makes you feel like the most important person in the room, pause. Ask yourself, is this person genuinely interested in me? Or are they trying to get me to feel something or do something for them? Does the intensity make sense? Or is it moving faster than trust can actually grow? Because if it's too good to be true, it probably isn't about truth at all. When you learn to question the charm instead of chasing it, you start reclaiming your power. And nothing scares a narcissist more than someone who no longer needs their approval. So let's move into the second way a narcissist gets you to do what they want: emotional manipulation, specifically through guilt, fear, and obligation. These are the psychological levers they pull when charm stops working. It's not as flashy as the love bombing, but it's just as effective. And in many cases, even more dangerous because it operates in the background. Quiet, subtle, insidious. Here's the thing about narcissisting: they study you, not in a curious or empathetic way, but like a strategist studies an opponent. They're trying to identify what emotional buttons make you move. Are you conflict averse? Do you hate letting people down? Do you pride yourself on being loyal, dependable? Great. Those are now the tools they'll use E against you. Let's start with guilt. This is a favorite. It doesn't even have to be overt. Sometimes it's as simple as a sigh, a silence, a disappointed glance. Other times it's direct on, "Ew, I just don't understand how you could do this to me after everything I've done for you." It's always framed in a way that makes you feel like the bad guy, even when you've done nothing wrong. That's the trick. Narcissists flip the script. They make your boundaries look like betrayal. They present all your needs as selfish. And because you care, because you're not a narcissist, you start to doubt yourself. Guilt is powerful because it attacks our sense of morality. It makes us feel like we're hurting someone by saying no. And for people who value compassion, that's a hard feeling to sit with. Narcissists know this. They don't appeal to your logic. They go straight for your conscience. They weaponize your empathy to keep you compliant. Then there's fear. Not always the dramatic kind, not threats or intimidation, but the subtle kind. Fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being rejected or abandoned. A narcissist might not yell or rage, although some do, but they'll often create an environment where you're constantly walking on eggshells. You start to hesitate before speaking your mind. You filter yourself, you shrink, and they never have to raise their voice because fear has already done the job for them. Fear is manipulated because it distorts our sense of safety. We start choosing peace over truth, harmony over honesty. But what we're really doing is trading authenticity for approval. And every time we do that, we lose a little bit of ourselves. And then there's obligation. This one is sneakier. Narcissists love to keep a ledger, spoken or unspoken, of all the things they've done for you. Every favor, every sacrifice, every time they showed up, even if it came with strings attached. So when you try to assert yourself, they bring out the record. After all I've done, this is how you repay me. It's not love, it's leverage. Here's where the philosophical layer comes in. These tactics work because they tap into deep-rooted psychological and even cultural beliefs that good people are selfless, that loyalty means self-sacrifice, that love means never walking away. But that's a distorted version of virtue. True compassion doesn't demand your silence. Real love doesn't punish you for having needs, and loyalty should never come at the cost of your well-being. Narcissists don't just explosions. They hijack your identity. They make you question your goodness. And once you start questioning that, you're much easier to control. You'll apologize for things you didn't do. You'll take responsibility for their pain. You'll say when everything in you is screaming no. Not because you want to, but because you're afraid of what it means if you don't. But here's the turning point: guilt, fear, and obligation only work when you agree to carry them. The moment you realize you don't owe anyone your peace, your silence, or your sense of self just to keep them comfortable, that's when everything changes. Narcissists can't manipulate a mind that's clear on its values. They can't control a person who refuses to trade emotional safety for external approval. So the next time someone makes you feel like a bad person for having boundaries or tries to turn your empathy into a leash, pause and ask yourself, you, whose voice is that in my head? And who benefits if I listen to it? When you stop confusing discomfort with wrongdoing, do that, you start to reclaim your voice, and no narcissist can survive in the presence of someone who finally knows their worth. Let's keep going, because once the calm fades and emotional manipulation sets in, there's usually one more powerful tactic that really locks it all into place. And that's gaslighting. This is where reality itself starts to slip. Gaslighting is not just lying. Lying is saying something false. Gaslighting is saying something false so convincingly and so repeatedly that you begin to question your own perception of truth. It's psychological warfare disguised as conversation. And it's one of the narcissist's favorite tools, because once they control your reality, they control everything else. Your decisions, your emotions, your identity. It usually starts small. You mentioned something that happened, something they said, or a moment that hurt you, and they respond with complete denial. That never happened. You're being dramatic. You always twist my words. And at first, you push back. You know what you saw. You know what you felt. But the more they deny, the more they repeat that you're where you start to wonder, what if I am? Especially if you're someone who's introspective, especially if you value fairness. Those traits, which are strengths, become vulnerabilities in the hands of a narcissist. The human brain doesn't like cognitive dissonance. When two opposing things exist, what you feel versus what you're being told, the brain tries to resolve it. In a healthy relationship, that's done through dialogue and honesty. But with a narcissist, you're not resolving anything. You're being over anything. And slowly, you start to default to their version of events just to find peace, just to avoid the tension, just to feel, okay, again, this is how gaslighting erodes your reality. You stop trusting your memory. You second guess your instincts. You look to them to tell you what's real, what's acceptable, what's true. And in doing that, you hand over the most valuable thing you have, your own perception of reality. You lose your inner compass. And once that's gone, you're not just easier to manipulate, you're dependent. Let's zoom out for a second. Philosophically, reality is built on perception. Your experience of the world is filtered through your senses, your emotions, your interpretation of events. When someone convinces you that your perception is flawed, or worse, untrustworthy, they're not just changing your opinion, they're rewriting your world. That's not just manipulation. That's psychological colonization. They move in, set up shop in your mind, do that, and gradually replace your voice with theirs. It's not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's just relentless. Tiny moments, repeated often enough, that chip away at your confidence. You forget that you were once grounded, that you had clarity, that you used to trust yourself. And the scariest part is, from the outside, no one may notice. Gaslighting is invisible. It leaves no bruises, but it creates deep, lasting scars that affect how you think, how you relate, and even how you exist. This is why survivors of narcissistic abuse often describe feeling like they're waking up from a fog once the relationship ends. They start remembering things that didn't make sense at the time, things they brushed off or felt too confused to address. They look back and wonder, how did I let it get that far? But the truth is, they didn't let it happen. It was done slowly, systematically, and deliberately. And here's the deeper truth in narcissists gaslight because they fear being exposed. If you trust your own mind, become a threat. If you trust your own truth, you can't be controlled. So they work overtime to keep you disoriented, unsure, doubting, because as long as you're lost in that fog, you'll keep turning to them for the map. But you don't need their map. You have your own, even if it's buried, even if it's been distorted, even if you've been told for years that it's wrong, your perception matters. Your emotions are valid. Your experience is real. Even if no one else sees it, even if they try to erase it. Reclaiming your reality isn't just about healing. It's about power, remembering that the truth doesn't need permission to exist. So if someone consistently makes you feel confused, like you're the problem, like your memory can't be trusted, pause. Look at the pattern, not the excuses. Ask yourself, who benefits when I doubt myself? You. When you reclaim your reality, you reclaim your freedom. And no one can rewrite your story without your consent.
Oh.
Now let's talk about one of the most deceptive and surprisingly effective tactics narcissists use to get you to do what they want, playing the victim. This is where things get twisted. Because instead of coming at you with control or dominance, they flip the dynamic. They make themselves the one who's been hurt. They put on the mask of suffering, and suddenly you're not defending yourself, you're defending at them. It's a psychological pivot that's easy to miss because it feels like empathy. It feels like you're doing the right thing. Someone you care about is struggling and you want to help. You want to be supportive. That's what good people do, right? But here's the catch with a narcissist. The victim role isn't about healing. It's about hijacking your emotional bandwidth. It's not about vulnerability. It's about control. Let me explain how this works. Narcissists deep down fear accountability. They see any criticism, even constructive feedback, as a threat to their ego. So instead of acknowledging fault or facing the discomfort of being wrong, they pivot fast. Into victimhood, you bring up something they did that hurt you, and suddenly you're hearing about their pain, their trauma, their struggles. Suddenly you're comforting them when 5 minutes ago, they were the one who crossed the line. And if you're not careful, you'll fall right into it. Not because you're weak, but because you're human, because you have compassion. Narcissists count on that. They know that if they cry at the right moment, tell the right story, bring up just enough past pain, you'll hesitate, you'll back off. And in that moment of hesitation, they regain control, not by force, not by fear, but through your empathy. This is what makes this tactic so powerful. It preys on your identity. If you see yourself as kind, caring, emotionally intelligent, you'll be even more vulnerable to it. Narcissists don't attack your character directly. They recruit it. They use your desire to be a good person as a way to keep you in line. Let's go deeper with this for a second. Philosophically, this speaks to a really complex tension in human relationships. The line between compassion and self-erasure. Yes, 100 something every time. We want to be there for people. Yes, we want to understand their pain. But when that impulse is manipulated, when it's turned against us, we're no longer helping, we're being used. We start to measure our goodness not by how we treat others, but by how much of ourselves we're willing to sacrifice to keep someone else from feeling uncomfortable. And narcissists take full advantage of that. They create a narrative where they read the misunderstood one, the one who's always being attacked, the one no one appreciates. And if you challenge that narrative, even gently, you're painted as cold, selfish, or uncaring. So you keep quiet, you let things go, you carry the emotional weight of the relationship, hoping that maybe if you just love them a little harder, they'll finally feel safe enough to change. But they won't, because the victim role isn't a stop on their healing journey. It's a weapon. It's a way to make sure you never leave, never challenge, never grow. Because if you do, they'll say you abandoned them, betrayed them. You'll be cast as the villain in a story you never agreed to be part of. And the worst part, sometimes they believe it too. That's what makes narcissism so slippery. It's not always conscious. They may genuinely feel like the victim, but just because they feel it doesn't make it true. Emotional pain is not the same as moral rightness. Feeling hurt doesn't always mean they were wrong. And just because someone cries doesn't mean the one who should apologize. So how do you protect yourself? You stay rooted in reality. You hold both truths at once, saying, oh yes, they may have pain. But that doesn't excuse their behavior. Yes, I care, but I still respect. Yes, they might see themselves as the victim, but I am allowed to have boundaries even when someone else is struggling. You, Lance, that's the balance. Compassion with clarity, empathy with limits. Do that. Love that doesn't require you to betray yourself just to keep someone else from falling apart. So if you find yourself constantly comforting someone after they've hurt you, if your needs always get sidelined by their crisis, if the person causing chaos keeps claiming they're the one being wounding, ask yourself, who's really bleeding and who just doesn't want to get their hands dirty. Because when false victimhood becomes a mask for manipulation, the most powerful thing you can do is stop apologizing for seeing clearly. Do that. Now let's talk about one of the most confusing and strangely effective tactics narcissists use to get you to do what they want: intermittent reinforcement. If that term sounds clinical, don't worry. It's basically the psychology of unpredictability, and it works almost like magic, not because it's logical, but because it taps directly into the way the human brain is wired for reward. Here's how it goes. A narcissist gives you just enough approval, affection, or validation to keep you hooked, but never consistently. One moment, you're the most important person in the world to them. They're praising you, showering you with attention, making you feel seen in a way that feels intoxicating. And then suddenly, it's cold. Do that. Distant, silent, or worse. They criticize you below you, act like you're the problem. You don't know what changed. You start trying to figure it out. What did I do wrong? Do that. How do I get back to the version of them that made me feel alive? Ian, right there. That's the trap. That's the addiction forming. Because the dopamine system in your brain doesn't just respond to pleasure. It responds even more strongly to unpredictable rewards. Think about slot machines. If you won every time you pulled the lever, you'd get bored. If you never won, you'd quit. But if you sometimes win, just often enough to keep you believing the next hit is coming, you'll keep pulling that lever until your wallet is empty. That's what intermittent reinforcement does. It keeps you chasing the high. With narcissists, the high is their approval, their love, their attention. And the lows, those are the punishments, the silentness, the criticism, the withdrawal. And because they're spaced out randomly, your nervous system never settles. 100th thing every time. You live in a state of tension, not knowing what version of them you're going to get, the charming one or the cruel one. And here's the wild part. The more unpredictable they are, the more effort you put in. You try harder to please them. You're thinking, maybe this time will work. You become hypervigilant, analyzing every detail of your own behavior, trying to anticipate their next mood shift. You internalize their inconsistency as your failure, not theirs. That's how powerful this tactic is. It gets you to take responsibility for their dysfunction. Let's bring it to the philosophical angle for a second. At its core, intermittent reinforcement is a distortion of hope. Hope is a powerful human drive. It gets us through pain. It pushes us to believe in redemption, in second chances, in growth. But in the hands of a narcissist, hope becomes a weapon. It's not rooted in reality. It's hooked to potential, to a memory of how good things used to be, or a fantasy of how good they could be if you just hold on a little longer. This is how narcissists get people to stay in unhealthy relationships far longer than they should. Not by being consistently awful, but by being occasionally amazing. They give you glimpses of something real. Enough to make you question your doubts. Enough to make you stay. You start bargaining, rationalizing, saying things like, they weren't always like this. Or they're just going through a hard time. Or, maybe if I change, things will get better. What you're really doing is clinging to crumbs and calling it a feast. You're chasing a person who only shows up when they want something from you. And that's not love. That's control disguised as connection. Eventually, you realize that the only thing consistent about them is the inconsistency. And the longer you stay in that cycle, the more your self-worth erodes. You stop trusting your gut. You start accepting chaos as normal. And once that baseline is set, you'll tolerate things you never would have imagined before. But here's the turning point. The power of intermittent reinforcement only works if you keep playing the game. The moment you stop chasing, stop reacting, stop seeking their approval, the cycle breaks. You remember what certainty feels like. You remember what stability is. And most importantly, you remember that real love doesn't come with emotional whiplash. So if you're constantly questioning where you stand, if you find yourself working harder and harder for less and less return, if every good moment feels like a lifeline instead of a foundation, ask yourself, is this connection feeding you? Do that. Or is it starving you slowly, just enough to keep you crawling back for more? Because love isn't supposed to feel like a slot machine. Do that. Here, things take an even darker, because when all else fails, when charm doesn't work, when guilt and gaslighting don't hold, when the intermittent affection starts wearing thin, narcissists turn to what might be their most primal weapon, fear. Not always in the obvious way. It's rarely just yelling or threats. It's often subtle, psychological, and calculated. Fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as the bad guy, fear of consequences. They create a dynamic where you're constantly bracing for the emotional fallout. This is the tactic of intimidation and control. And it doesn't have to look like a raised fist or slammed door. Sometimes it's the quiet tension in a room when you disagree with them, the way they go cold when you set a boundary, the passive-aggressive silence, the sharp, measured tone. Sometimes it's just a look, one that says, you're on thin ice. A narcissist rely on fear to maintain dominance, not necessarily because they enjoy seeing you scared, though in extreme cases that's true, but because fear creates compliance. It paralyzes you. When you're afraid, you start to shrink yourself, tiptoe, you second guess. You stop expressing your needs. You start editing your personality to avoid triggering them. And over time, that fear seeps into your bones. You lose track of who you are before the tension became constant. What's wild is how quickly fear becomes normal. Our brains are designed to adapt to survive. So if you're living in a psychologically unsafe environment, your brain will find ways to cope, to minimize the threat. You'll convince yourself it's not bad. You'll say things like, at least they're not hitting me. Or it's just their personality. Or maybe I'm just too sensitive. But those rationalizations don't mean the fear isn't real. It means you've started to normalize the anxiety. And here's where it gets philosophical, because fear at its core isn't just an emotion. It's a signal. It tells us something's wrong. Something is off. Something is not aligned with our dignity, our peace, or our autonomy. But narcissists will make you doubt that signal. They'll punish you for feeling it. They'll frame your discomfort as your problem, not theirs. And when that happens enough times, you start silencing your own instincts just to keep the peace. This creates a mental and emotional prison. You may not even realize you're locked inside it because the bars are invisible. Built from self-doubt, guilt, confusion, and fear of setting them off, you start thinking, if I just stay calm, they won't explode. If I agree with them, punish me, if I keep my mouth shut, I'll survive this day, and you will. But that's all you'll do. Survive, not grow, not live freely. Just survive. And for many people, survival becomes the goal, especially if they've been in this dynamic for years, especially if they were raised in it. But that's the final stage of control, when the narcissist no longer has to anything to dominate you. You've internalized their voice. You enforce their rules on yourself. You live small so they can feel big. That's the real tragedy of this kind of fear-based control. You end up policing your own freedom. Now look, not every narcissist is physically dangerous. Some never raise their voice. But psychological intimidation is just destructive. It's the constant pressure to conform, obey, and appease. Even when it violates your values or boundaries, it's not about partnership. It's about hierarchy. They're the sun. You orbit around them, step out of line, and the cold silence or explosive reaction reminds you exactly where you stand. But here's what narcissists never count on: that fear can evolve. At first, it paralyzes. But eventually, if you let it, it can clarify. When you stop running from it and start listening it, fear can become your compass. It can point you back to yourself. It can say, this is not okay. This is not who I am. This is not the life I want to live. And in that moment, fear stops being a leash and starts becoming a key. So if you've been walking on eggshells, if you've been molding yourself to fit someone else's comfort while living in your own discomfort, if you've been afraid to speak, to breathe freely, then hear this: fear is not always the enemy. Sometimes it's the signal that it's finally time to walk away.